They told me not to look, not to get attached, not to let my heart break for the baby who called a hospital room home. I was 23 years old, drowning in medical school debt, surviving on instant ramen and caffeine, when I first heard the whispers in the pediatric ward at Mercy General Hospital in rural Ohio. "There's a child who lives here," a nurse mentioned casually during morning rounds. "Been here since birth. Mother walked out the day she was delivered." I remember saying I didn't want to know her name, didn't want to see her face. Medical school teaches you to maintain distance, to build walls between your heart and your patients. You treat the condition, not the soul. You document, diagnose, discharge. You don't fall in love. But then I saw her. 15 months old, lying in a hospital crib facing a peeling wall in a room with windows too high to show her the sky. She had a tracheostomy tube, a feeding tube, couldn't move below her waist. Born with spina bifida and abandoned because her disabilities were too much for a family that already had 3 other special needs children. When I walked into that room during my pediatric rotation, she smiled at me. This child, who had never been held while sleeping, never been rocked to sleep, never heard a lullaby, smiled as if she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to finally see her. I called my mom that night, my voice shaking. "There's a baby living at the hospital. She has nobody. I can't just leave her there." My mom, bless her heart, didn't lecture me about being a broke medical student with 3 more years of residency ahead. She didn't remind me that I was barely keeping myself afloat. She just said, "When can I meet her?" 1 week. That's how long it took for my entire life to change direction. 7 days from I need to maintain professional boundaries to standing in family court with my parents, fighting to become this child's family. The judge approved emergency guardianship in 15 days because she was medically fragile, and every day in that hospital was another infection waiting to happen. What I didn't know then was that bringing Emily home was just the beginning. I didn't know about the midnight ambulance rides, the specialists who had no answers, the pandemic that would nearly take her from us, or the 2 more children who would eventually complete our chaotic, beautiful family. This is the story of how one smile changed everything. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button and smash the like if this story is gripping you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read them all. Now, back to what happened next. Some people spend years planning their journey into parenthood. They pick out nursery colors, read parenting books, attend prenatal classes, and count down the days until they meet their baby. They have timelines, savings accounts, and carefully constructed visions of what their family will look like. I had none of that. I was a 23-year-old medical student with $200,000 in student loans, a shared apartment the size of a shoebox, and a relationship that was still figuring itself out. My 5-year plan involved surviving residency, maybe traveling, eventually settling down. Children were a distant dream, something for future me to worry about when life felt more stable, more certain, more ready. But life doesn't wait for you to feel ready. During my final year of medical school, while rotating through pediatrics at a small hospital in rural Ohio, I encountered something that shattered every preconception I had about love, family, and what it means to be a mother. I met a child who had been living in a hospital room since the day she was born. 15 months of her life spent staring at peeling walls and high windows, cared for by rotating nurses, abandoned by the family who should have loved her most. The moment I saw her smile, everything changed. What followed was a whirlwind I couldn't have prepared for, even if I'd tried. Emergency court hearings, midnight medical crises, learning to operate feeding tubes and tracheostomies while juggling clinical rotations, moving back in with my parents because I couldn't afford the medical equipment she needed, watching my bank account drain while my heart filled in ways I never knew possible. They say you can't pour from an empty cup, that you need to be financially stable and emotionally prepared before taking on the responsibility of a child. But sometimes love doesn't ask permission. Sometimes it just shows up in room 217 and changes your entire life with a single smile. The pediatric ward at Mercy General smelled like antiseptic and something else I could never quite name. Maybe defeat, maybe hope worn thin. I'd been rotating through for 2 weeks and every morning felt like walking through quicksand. We'd just finished examining a 4-year-old whose stepfather had done unspeakable things, and I'd spent my lunch break crying in a supply closet. My supervising resident found me there and said what they always say: "You need thicker skin for this specialty." I didn't want thicker skin. I wanted to feel everything, to carry every story, to remember that these weren't just cases, they were lives. But that afternoon, exhausted and emotionally raw, I heard the nurses talking about a patient in room 217, and my first instinct was pure self-preservation. Don't go in there. Don't look. Don't let another broken story crack you open. The rumors had been circulating since my first day. A baby who lived at the hospital, 15 months old, born with spina bifida, hydrocephalus, a whole alphabet of medical complications. Her mother had signed the birth certificate, stayed long enough for the social worker to document her presence, then disappeared into whatever life she'd decided was more important than the daughter she'd left behind. The nurses would wheel her around the corridors during shift changes, this tiny girl in an oversized hospital gown, just so she wouldn't spend every waking hour staring at the same 4 walls. I was assigned to a different patient that day, a 3-year-old with pneumonia whose mother never left his bedside. She was there when we did morning rounds, there during visiting hours, there at midnight when I came back to check labs. She slept in that awful reclining chair that doesn't really recline, ate cafeteria food that barely qualified as nutrition, and never once complained. Every time I walked past room 217, I thought about the contrast. 2 children, same hallway, completely different universes of love and abandonment. My attending physician, Dr. Richardson, was discussing treatment plans when I saw them bring her out. The nurses had dressed her in one of those hospital gowns with faded teddy bears, and she was propped up in a specialized stroller, her head tilted slightly to one side because she couldn't quite hold it straight. We were standing in a circle, 5 medical students, 2 residents, Dr. Richardson holding court about proper documentation procedures, and they parked her right in the middle of us while they consulted with the respiratory therapist about her tracheostomy care. She looked at each of our faces like she was memorizing us. Her eyes were this startling shade of brown, almost amber in the fluorescent hospital lighting, and they moved from person to person with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone so young. Then she smiled. Not at anyone in particular, just smiled at the fact that people were near her, talking, existing in her orbit. It was the kind of smile that didn't know it should be sad, that hadn't learned yet that her situation was supposed to be tragic. Something inside my chest cracked open. I'd spent 2 weeks building walls, telling myself I needed distance to survive this rotation, practicing the clinical detachment they'd been drilling into us since first year. But watching this child smile at strangers who would walk away and forget her by dinner time, that destroyed every defense I'd carefully constructed. I couldn't stop staring at her, couldn't focus on whatever Dr. Richardson was saying about proper chart notation. All I could think was, who puts her to bed at night? Who sings to her? Who tells her she matters? After rounds, I cornered my classmate James, who'd been assigned to room 217 for the week. "What's her prognosis?" I asked, trying to sound professionally curious rather than personally devastated. He shrugged, flipping through his notes. "Stable, I guess. Medically speaking, she could live a normal lifespan with proper care, but she's been cleared for discharge for months. There's just nowhere for her to go. Foster system won't take her because of the medical complexity. Special needs facilities have waiting lists years long, so she just stays. She just stays," I repeated, the words tasting like ashes. A child spending her entire existence in a hospital room because the system designed to protect her had nowhere to put her. That night I sat in my apartment, my tiny, cramped, barely affordable apartment that suddenly felt obscenely luxurious, and I couldn't stop thinking about those amber eyes and that inexplicable smile. My boyfriend Marcus came over with Thai food, found me crying at my kitchen table and asked what was wrong. "There's a baby living at the hospital," I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I knew they sounded absurd. He sat down across from me, concerned but clearly not understanding the magnitude. "That's really sad," he offered, passing me the pad thai. "But you can't save everyone, babe. That's not sustainable." He was right, of course. You can't save everyone. Medical school teaches you that in 100 different ways, through 1,000 small heartbreaks. You learn to triage, to prioritize, to accept that some battles can't be won. But sitting there with my takeout getting cold, I realized I wasn't thinking about saving everyone. I was thinking about one specific person in room 217 and whether sustainable was even the right question to be asking. I called my mom at midnight, which should have been my first sign that I was about to do something completely irrational. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the late hour. She'd been a nurse for 30 years before retiring, which meant her internal clock was permanently set to, "Someone might need me." I could hear my father in the background, asking if everything was okay, if I was safe, because midnight calls from your daughter in medical school generally mean crisis or catastrophe. "I'm fine," I said quickly, then immediately contradicted myself by bursting into tears. She waited. That was my mother's superpower. The ability to sit in silence while someone else fell apart, not rushing to fix or soothe, just holding space for whatever needed to come out. I told her everything. About the pediatric rotation that was destroying me piece by piece. About the little girl in room 217 who smiled at strangers. About how I couldn't sleep because I kept imagining her lying there in the dark, alone, with only the beeping of monitors for company. About how insane it was that I was even thinking what I was thinking, given that I was broke and overwhelmed and barely keeping my own life together. "What are you thinking?" Mom asked, her voice carefully neutral. She already knew. Mothers always know. But she was going to make me say it out loud, make me hear how it sounded outside my own head. I took a shaky breath. I want to get her out of there. I don't know how, but I can't just leave her. I can't just finish this rotation and move on like she doesn't exist. The pause that followed felt eternal. I could hear my father's voice again, closer now, and my mother's murmured explanation. Then she was back on the line, and her next words changed the trajectory of my entire life. "When can we meet her?" Not, "Are you crazy?" Not, "You're a student, you can't possibly." Just, "When can we meet her?" I went back to the hospital the next morning with a plan that was barely half formed. I cornered the social worker, a woman named Patricia who looked perpetually exhausted, and had probably heard every idealistic medical student save the world pitch 1,000 times before. "I want to know what it would take to get Emily." I stopped, realizing I'd used her name for the first time, making her real rather than abstract. "The patient in 217. What would it take to get her into a home?" Patricia looked up from her computer screen, her expression somewhere between skeptical and intrigued. "You mean a foster placement?" "We've been trying. Her medical needs are significant. 24-hour care, specialized equipment, multiple weekly appointments. Most foster families aren't equipped for that level of complexity, and the facilities that could handle her have intake processes that take months, sometimes years. What if someone wanted to adopt her directly?" The question came out before I'd fully thought it through, and Patricia's eyebrows shot up. I rushed forward, words tumbling out in a nervous cascade. "I mean, hypothetically, if a family wanted to pursue adoption, what would that process look like?" She studied me for a long moment, and I could see her doing the math, young medical student, probably drowning in debt, clearly emotionally invested in a patient. Recipe for disaster. But something in my face must have convinced her I was serious, because she pulled out a folder and started explaining. The process was Byzantine. First, Emily's biological mother would need to be located and her parental rights officially terminated. Then there would be background checks, home studies, financial assessments, interviews with social workers and psychologists. The timeline could be anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, assuming everything went smoothly. And nothing in the child welfare system ever went smoothly. But, Patricia added, leaning forward slightly, in cases where a child is medically fragile and has been abandoned in a hospital setting, emergency guardianship can sometimes be granted much faster. If approved, it would allow a family to take custody while the formal adoption process played out. I spent my lunch break researching emergency guardianship on my phone, sitting in my car because I couldn't focus anywhere else. The requirements seemed impossible. Stable housing, proof of income, references, a home study that would evaluate everything from my living situation to my mental health history. I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with a roommate who worked nights and left her dishes in the sink for days. My income consisted of student loans and the occasional shift I picked up at a campus health clinic. I was 23 years old and couldn't even keep a houseplant alive. But then I thought about my parents. My mom, who'd raised 3 kids while working full-time as a nurse. My dad, who'd built our childhood home's deck by hand because we couldn't afford a contractor. They had a house with extra bedrooms, financial stability, decades of parenting experience. What if they became Emily's legal guardians while I finished school? What if we approached this as a family decision rather than my solo crusade? That weekend, I drove the 3 hours back to my hometown, my stomach churning with anxiety the entire way. I'd told my parents I needed to talk to them about something important, and my mother had immediately started preparing my favorite foods, her way of creating a safe space for difficult conversations. We sat around the kitchen table where I'd done homework and had breakdowns and celebrated acceptances to medical school, and I told them everything. I showed them pictures I'd taken of Emily on my phone, explained her medical situation, outlined the guardianship process, and then waited for them to tell me I was being ridiculous. My father spoke first, his voice gruff with emotion. "You want us to adopt a baby while you're in medical school." It wasn't quite a question, more like he was testing how the words sounded out loud. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He looked at my mother, some silent communication passing between them that comes from 30 years of marriage, then back at me. "Show me those pictures again." We spent the next 6 hours talking through every angle. The financial implications, specialized formula, medical equipment, insurance coverage. The logistical challenges. My dad would need to modify their home for wheelchair accessibility. My mom would need to learn tracheostomy care. The emotional weight of taking on a child with significant medical needs, knowing there would be hospital stays and emergencies and no guarantee of what her future would look like. My younger sister called in the middle of our discussion, and within minutes she was on speakerphone saying, "Obviously we're doing this. When do I get to meet my niece?" Monday morning, I walked into Patricia's office with my parents flanking me like we were going into battle. Maybe we were. "We want to apply for emergency guardianship," my mother announced, her nurse voice brooking no argument. "What do we need to do?" Patricia looked at the 3 of us and something in her expression softened. She'd probably seen 100 families start this process and abandon it when reality hit. But she pulled out the paperwork anyway. The next 2 weeks were a blur of forms and interviews and background checks. My parents had to get fingerprinted, provide tax returns, submit to home inspections. I had to write statements explaining my relationship to Emily and my role in the guardianship arrangement. We compiled medical records, consulted with her doctors, met with lawyers who specialized in child welfare cases. Every night I'd collapse into bed, exhausted and terrified that this whole thing would fall apart, that some bureaucratic detail would derail everything. Then Emily got sick. Pneumonia, the nurses told me when I arrived for my shift to find room 217 empty and her transferred to the PICU. I wasn't family, so technically I wasn't supposed to have access, but one of the ICU nurses recognized me from my rotation and let me slip in. She was on a ventilator, her tiny chest rising and falling with mechanical precision, and all I could think was, "Please don't die now. Not when we're so close to getting you out of here. Not when you're finally going to have a home." I sat by her bed during every spare moment, whispering promises I had no business making. Promises that she'd sleep in a real bedroom, not a hospital room. That she'd have a family who chose her, who fought for her, who would never walk away. That she mattered, even if the person who should have loved her most couldn't see it. The PICU attending found me there at 2 a.m. on a night I wasn't even scheduled, and instead of kicking me out, she just pulled up another chair and sat with me in silence. Emily improved slowly, fighting her way back with a resilience that seemed impossible for someone so small. And exactly 2 weeks after my parents submitted their emergency guardianship application, a judge signed the papers that would change all of our lives forever. The day we brought Emily home, the sky was impossibly blue. the kind of April afternoon that feels like the world is showing off. My parents had spent the previous 72 hours transforming their guest bedroom into something that could accommodate medical equipment while still feeling like a child's room. My father installed special shelving for supplies. My mother had sewn curtains with butterflies, and my sister had painted a mural of a garden across one wall because every kid deserves to see flowers when they wake up. I'd taken the day off from my rotation, calling in a favor I probably couldn't afford to use. But watching Emily's face as we carried her out of Mercy General for the first time in her life, that was worth any professional consequence. She looked at everything with wide eyes, tracking the movement of clouds, the sway of tree branches, the passing cars. 15 months of existence, and this was her first time experiencing the world beyond hospital walls. The drive from the hospital to my parents' house took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Emily was strapped into a specialized car seat we'd spent 2 weeks learning to use properly, her tracheostomy and feeding tube carefully secured. I sat in the back seat next to her, unable to look away, terrified that she'd stop breathing or that we'd forgotten some crucial piece of equipment. My mother drove with the careful precision of someone transporting nitroglycerin, and my father kept checking the GPS even though he'd driven this route 10,000 times. When we pulled into the driveway, my sister burst out of the front door with a banner she'd made that said, "Welcome home, Emily," in letters 3 feet tall. The neighbors who'd known me since I was born started appearing on their porches, waving, some of them crying. Mrs. Chen from next door brought over a casserole. The Johnsons offered to help with anything we needed. This was small-town America at its finest, a community rallying around one tiny girl they'd never met, because caring for each other was just what you did. Carrying Emily across the threshold felt ceremonial, sacred somehow. My mother had her, supporting her head with practiced ease, whispering, "You're home now, sweetheart. You're finally home." We settled her into her new room, and for the first few minutes she just looked around, processing the colors and the soft lighting, and the fact that the ceiling wasn't institutional white tiles. Then she started to cry. Not distressed crying, but the confused tears of someone whose entire reality had just shifted. That first night was chaos. The home health agency had promised to send a night nurse to help us through the transition, but she called an hour before her shift to say she'd taken another case. So there we were, me with my barely sufficient medical knowledge, my mother with her nursing background that was 30 years focused on adults, not pediatrics, and my father gamely trying to follow the 17-page instruction manual the hospital had sent home. Emily's feeding pump kept alarming. We couldn't figure out how to properly position her trach collar, and every sound she made sent us into panic mode. Around 2 a.m., after the 4th time we'd called the on-call pediatrician, my mother finally sat down on the floor of Emily's room and laughed. Not the hysterical laughter of someone losing it, but the genuine amusement of recognizing absurdity. "We have no idea what we're doing," she said, and somehow that admission broke the tension. We were all terrified, all in over our heads, and pretending otherwise was exhausting. My father joined her on the floor, then me, the 3 of us sitting around Emily's specialized crib like we were camping, comparing notes on what we'd learned and what still baffled us. The first month was a brutal education. We discovered that Emily's seizures weren't being properly controlled because the hospital had focused on keeping her stable, rather than optimizing her medications. We learned that she'd never had physical therapy, occupational therapy, or speech therapy, the standard interventions for her condition, because the hospital didn't have the resources to provide ongoing developmental support for a long-term resident. She couldn't recognize her own hands, would startle when you touched her left side, and had the muscle tone of someone who'd been bedridden her entire life because, essentially, she had been. I started making appointments with specialists, using my medical school connections shamelessly. The pediatric neurologist was someone who'd lectured in my second-year class, so I sent him an email explaining the situation. He got us in within a week, reviewed her records, and immediately adjusted her seizure medications. The orthopedic surgeon who'd done a guest lecture on spina bifida complications agreed to evaluate her. The developmental pediatrician, who usually had a 6-month waiting list, squeezed us in, because her daughter had been one of my study partners. Every doctor had the same reaction when they heard our story, a mixture of admiration and concern that we were biting off more than we could chew. They'd look at me, this young medical student with dark circles under her eyes, and ask if I understood what I'd taken on. I wanted to laugh. Understanding and experiencing are entirely different things. I understood, intellectually, that Emily would require constant care. I hadn't understood what it would feel like to sleep in 2-hour increments, to plan my entire life around therapy schedules and medication times, to become fluent in medical jargon that most parents never have to learn. But I also hadn't understood the joy. The first time Emily laughed, actually laughed, this bubbling sound that came through her trach, I cried for 20 minutes. When she started tracking movement with her eyes, deliberately reaching for toys instead of staring passively at whatever was in front of her, my mother called me at school sobbing with happiness. These milestones that most parents took for granted felt monumental, because we knew how much harder Emily had to fight for each tiny victory. My own life became a high-wire act of competing priorities. I'd wake up at 5 a.m. to help with Emily's morning routine before driving back to my apartment to shower and change for a 7 a.m. lecture. Between classes, I'd call my mother for updates, walk her through any medical concerns, arrange specialist appointments. I'd study in the hospital cafeteria during Emily's therapy sessions, memorizing pharmacology while watching her work with a physical therapist who was teaching her body awareness. My grades started slipping. My relationship with Marcus became strained because I was never available, and my friends stopped inviting me places because I always had to say no. Marcus tried to be supportive, but he existed in a different universe, one where weekends were for sleeping in and spontaneous road trips, not for learning how to change tracheostomy ties or attending seizure management workshops. One Saturday night, he showed up at my parents' house expecting to take me to a party, found me elbow-deep in medical supplies, and just stood there looking lost. "This isn't what I signed up for," he said, and I couldn't even argue because he was right. He'd signed up to date a medical student, not someone cosplaying as a parent to a medically complex child. We broke up in my parents' driveway, a conversation that was probably 6 weeks overdue. He wasn't cruel about it, just honest. He was 24 years old and wanted a girlfriend who could be spontaneous, who didn't cancel dates because of medical emergencies, who could focus on their relationship instead of being perpetually distracted by someone else's needs. I watched him drive away and felt mostly relief, which probably told me everything I needed to know about where my priorities actually were. My sister found me sitting on the porch steps an hour later, not crying, but just existing in the strange liminal space of a breakup that felt inevitable. She sat down next to me, bumping her shoulder against mine. "You okay?" I nodded, then shook my head, then laughed because I didn't actually know. "He wasn't wrong," I said. "This is insane. I'm 23 years old. I have 3 more years of medical school, and I'm essentially parenting a toddler with more medical equipment than some hospital rooms." "Yeah," my sister agreed, then smiled. "But have you seen the way she looks at you? Like you hung the moon? That's not insane, that's love." We sat there in the cooling evening, listening to the sounds of my parents getting Emily ready for bed, my mother's gentle voice reading a story, my father's off-key singing, Emily's delighted sounds in response. This was my life now, messy and complicated and nothing like I'd imagined. But standing up to go back inside, to help with bedtime routine and study for Monday's exam, and fall asleep in the chair next to Emily's crib, because I couldn't quite convince myself to leave her alone yet, I realized I wouldn't trade it for anything. By the time summer arrived, we'd fallen into a rhythm that almost felt sustainable, right up until Emily stopped breathing in the middle of Target. We'd been shopping for supplies, specialized formula, extra trach tubes, the endless medical necessities that had become mundane grocery items. Emily was in her adaptive stroller, looking around at the bright lights and overwhelming stimulation of the store like she was visiting an alien planet. My mother was comparing prices on feeding tube extensions while I grabbed syringes from the pharmacy section, both of us operating on autopilot after 3 months of this routine. Then Emily's face turned blue, Not gradually, not with warning signs I'd missed, just suddenly, terrifyingly blue. Her lips, her fingertips, the color draining from her skin like someone had flipped a switch. I dropped everything in my hands, medical training kicking in before conscious thought could catch up. Trach obstruction, my brain supplied clinically, even as my hands shook pulling the emergency supplies from the bag under her stroller. My mother was already there, her old nursing instincts activated, clearing the area while I suctioned Emily's trach. Nothing. The catheter wasn't pulling anything out, which meant complete blockage. I'd practiced this scenario 100 times in controlled settings, but performing an emergency trach change in the middle of target, while a crowd gathered and someone screamed for a manager, was entirely different. My hands fumbled with the ties, my mother holding Emily steady, both of us operating in this crystalline space where terror and training intersected. The old track came out. New one went in. Emily gasped, color flooding back into her face, and I realized I'd been holding my breath the entire time. An employee approached with a first aid kit and a panicked expression, and I nearly laughed at the absurdity. What was a Band-Aid going to do? But I managed to say, "We're okay, medical situation handled," in a voice that sounded remarkably calm given that my entire body was trembling. We left our half-filled cart in the aisle and went straight to the emergency room, because that's what you do when your child stops breathing, even if you've successfully resolved the immediate crisis. The ER doctor, who couldn't have been more than a few years older than me, listened to our story and looked at Emily's complex medical history with the expression of someone who'd drawn the short straw. He ordered X-rays and blood work, consulted with pulmonology, and eventually determined that Emily had developed granulation tissue around her trach site that was periodically obstructing her airway. This was our introduction to the reality that stability was always temporary. Just when we thought we'd figured everything out, Emily's body would throw us a new curveball. The granulation tissue required cauterization, which required sedation, which required an overnight hospital stay because you don't take chances with a child who has a trach. So we went from shopping trip to hospital admission in the space of 3 hours, my mother calling my father to bring overnight bags while I rearranged my exam schedule because missing Emily's procedure wasn't even a question. The hospital stay turned into 3 days because Emily developed a fever, and fever in a kid with a trach always raises infection concerns. I camped out in her room, studying for finals surrounded by monitors and IV poles, my attending professors emailing me lecture notes with subject lines like, "Heard you're in the hospital again. Hang in there." The other medical students in my year were taking beach trips and sleeping off 4 years of stress, and I was conjugating medical Spanish verbs while a nurse taught me advanced trach care techniques. My sister visited on day 2, bringing coffee and the textbook I'd forgotten at home, and found me having a minor breakdown in the family bathroom. Not about Emily specifically, but about everything. The weight of responsibility, the constant vigilance, the way my entire life had been consumed by someone else's needs. I can't remember the last time I did something just for me, I admitted, sitting on the bathroom floor because it was the only private space in the entire pediatric ward. I can't remember who I was before this. She sat down next to me, not bothered by the questionable cleanliness of hospital bathroom floors. You were someone who cried in supply closets because you cared too much. Now you're someone who performs emergency procedures in Target because you care too much. Same person, bigger stakes. It wasn't particularly comforting, but it was honest. This was who I'd always been, someone who couldn't maintain professional distance, who brought home every story, who saw a suffering child and thought, "I can fix this," before thinking about the cost. When we finally got discharged, my parents sat me down for a conversation I'd been dreading. My father, who'd been mostly supportive but quietly concerned, looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "We need to talk about next year," he said, and my stomach dropped. Next year, I'd be starting my clinical rotations full-time, longer hours, more demanding schedule. Next year, I was supposed to be figuring out my specialty, networking for residency positions, becoming a doctor instead of just studying to be one. "We can handle her care," my mother added quickly. "That's not the question." but you need to think about what you want your role to be here. You're not her legal guardian. We are. You could step back, focus on school, be involved without carrying all of this weight." She gestured vaguely, encompassing the hospital room we'd just left, the medical supplies that had taken over their garage, the reality that Emily's care was a marathon, not a sprint. I understood what she was offering: permission to reclaim my life, to be Emily's big sister instead of her de facto parent. It was logical, practical, probably healthier for everyone involved. But the thought of stepping back, of not being her primary person, felt like cutting off a limb. "I can't," I said simply. "I know I should probably want to, but I can't." My parents exchanged a look and my father sighed. "Then we need to make this official. You should be her legal guardian, not us. We'll handle the legal paperwork. But this needs to reflect reality." The conversation I should have had before we started this whole process finally happened in a Denny's parking lot at 9 p.m., all of us too exhausted to go home and too wired to sleep. My mother laid out the practicalities. If I became Emily's legal guardian, I'd be responsible for all medical decisions, financial planning, long-term care arrangements. I'd need to find a residency program that would accommodate her needs, which meant ruling out anything too far away or too demanding. I'd be a single parent throughout the hardest years of medical training, with no co-parent to share the load. "And dating," my sister added helpfully. "You'll need to find someone willing to sign up for all of this," which, not to be pessimistic, but that's a pretty specific type of person. She wasn't wrong. Marcus had walked away from a relationship that required occasional inconvenience. How many people would willingly step into a situation where a medically complex child was part of the package from day one? But sitting there in that parking lot, watching through the window as Emily slept in my father's arms, I realized the decision had already been made. Probably back in room 217 when she'd first smiled at me, or maybe in that first midnight phone call to my mother, or possibly the moment I'd told Patricia I wanted to know about adoption. I'd been Emily's mother in every way that mattered since the day we brought her home. The paperwork would just make official what my heart had already claimed. The legal process took 6 months of bureaucracy and court appearances and a judge who looked at me, now 24, still in medical school, still living partially out of my childhood bedroom, and asked if I understood the permanence of what I was requesting. I wanted to laugh. I'd changed her trach in the middle of Target. I'd memorized her medication schedule better than my own. I could recognize the subtle difference between her "I'm bored" cry and her "something's wrong" cry from 3 rooms away. Did I understand permanence? I was living it. The day the adoption was finalized, we had a small celebration at my parents' house. Nothing elaborate, just family and the neighbors who'd become our support system. Cake from the bakery that always spelled Emily's name wrong, and a ridiculous number of balloons that Emily mostly ignored in favor of watching the ceiling fan. The home health nurse who'd been coming 3 times a week brought flowers. Mrs. Chen made enough food for an army. The physical therapist stopped by on her way home from work. My sister gave a toast that made everyone cry, about how she'd watched me transform from someone who killed houseplants into someone who could handle medical emergencies without flinching. My father talked about being proud and terrified in equal measure. My mother said something about love making you braver than you ever knew possible. And I stood there holding Emily, who had no idea this was a special occasion but was content in my arms, and thought about how completely my life had diverged from any plan I'd ever made. Later that night, after everyone had left and Emily was asleep in her crib, I sat in the nursery filling out paperwork for her new birth certificate, the one that would list me as her mother, erasing the woman who'd walked away and replacing her with someone who'd stumbled into parenthood completely unprepared, but wholly committed. I thought about writing something profound in my journal, marking this milestone, but I was too exhausted. So I just wrote the date, added officially Emily's mom, and fell asleep in the rocking chair that had become my second bed. 2 years later, I would look back on that moment as the easy part, before the pandemic, before the second adoption, before I learned that loving someone doesn't protect them from the world's capacity for crisis. March 2020 brought 2 things I wasn't prepared for: medical school graduation pushed online, and a global pandemic that turned Emily's routine medical complexity into a terrifying vulnerability. The news showed refrigerator trucks outside hospitals, ventilator shortages, mortality rates that spiked for anyone with underlying conditions. Emily had approximately 7 underlying conditions, depending on how you counted. Every public health announcement might as well have had her photo attached with the caption, "Exactly who this virus will kill." We went into lockdown before the official orders came down. My parents, who'd been our primary backup support, couldn't risk exposure because my father had diabetes. My sister, working as a teacher navigating remote learning chaos, was exposed to too many families to safely be around Emily. The home health agency suspended in-person visits, citing staff shortages and infection control protocols. Suddenly it was just me, Emily, and the terrifying reality that if I brought COVID home, I would likely kill my daughter. I'd matched into ophthalmology residency at Ohio State, scheduled to start in July. The program director called in April to discuss contingency plans. The residency was still happening, but rotations might be restructured, schedules compressed, everything uncertain. I needed to find housing in Columbus, arrange Emily's care transfers to new specialists, figure out logistics for a move during a pandemic. Instead, I was Googling, "How long does COVID survive on surfaces?" and sanitizing our mail with Lysol wipes. Emily caught COVID in June. Despite every precaution, every mask, every bleach-washed grocery bag, the virus found its way into our home. She spiked a fever on a Tuesday afternoon, and by Wednesday morning she was in respiratory distress. The ER was overwhelmed, patients lining the hallways, and we got triaged to a curtained area next to someone actively dying. I stood there holding Emily's hand while she struggled to breathe, thinking about how we'd done everything right, and it hadn't mattered at all. They admitted her to the PICU because her oxygen saturation was dropping, and her track made her high risk for rapid deterioration. I couldn't go with her. Hospital policy, 1 parent per patient, no exceptions, and even that parent couldn't leave the room without potentially losing access. So I made the impossible choice to stay, moving into her hospital room like I was deploying to a war zone. My phone became my only connection to the outside world. My mother texting updates about my apartment, my residency program emailing contingency plans, my sister sending photos of normal life that felt like reports from another planet. Emily got worse before she got better. The COVID progressed to encephalitis, brain inflammation that made her seize almost continuously. They put her in a medically induced coma, trying to give her brain time to heal while the virus ran its course. For 12 days, I sat next to a child who looked like Emily but didn't respond, didn't react, just lay there connected to machines that breathed for her and fed her and monitored her brain activity. The neurologist showed me EEG readings that made no sense to my ophthalmology-focused training, explaining gently that we wouldn't know the extent of permanent damage until she woke up. The worst part wasn't the medical crisis. I could handle medical crises. The worst part was the isolation. No visitors, no physical support, just me and a nursing staff that changed every 12 hours and saw hundreds of patients exactly like Emily. I'd walk laps around her room because there was nowhere else to go, call my mother and try not to cry, review journal articles about COVID encephalitis outcomes that were mostly speculative because the virus was too new for long-term data. At 2 a.m., I'd stand at the window looking at the empty parking lot and wonder if I'd made the right choice bringing her home from room 217, if I'd sentenced her to a slightly longer, slightly more loved life that still ended too soon. She woke up on day 13. Not dramatically, not with some miraculous sudden recovery, just gradually started responding to stimuli. First her eyes tracking movement, then small reactions to touch, finally a squeeze of my hand that made me sob so hard a nurse came running. The encephalitis had done damage. Her already limited mobility was more limited, her seizures more frequent, her entire baseline shifted to a new, more fragile normal. But she was alive, and she recognized me. And after 12 days of uncertainty, that felt like winning the lottery. We stayed in the hospital another 3 weeks. Emily had to relearn how to tolerate her feeding tube, how to maintain stable oxygen levels, how to exist without the sedation that had kept her comfortable while her brain healed. I had to learn a whole new set of protocols, medication adjustments, therapy modifications, emergency plans for a child whose medical complexity had just leveled up. My residency program was astonishingly understanding, pushing my start date back 2 months, but I could feel the pressure building of a life paused while Emily's crisis played out. When we finally got discharged, home felt like a foreign country. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt safe. I sanitized surfaces compulsively, masked around Emily even though we'd both already had COVID, monitored her oxygen saturation obsessively. My mother, fully vaccinated by August, came over and found me having a panic attack because I couldn't remember if I'd given Emily her afternoon medications. "You're running on empty," she said, which was both obvious and completely unhelpful, because what choice did I have? Starting residency in September while Emily was still recovering felt like being torn in half. My program tried to be accommodating, but ophthalmology residency doesn't really have a easy mode. There were surgeries to learn, clinics to staff, call schedules to fulfill. I'd leave Emily with my parents, drive to the hospital, scrub into a cataract surgery, and spend the entire procedure worrying about whether she was having a seizure. My co-residents were mostly understanding, but there was an undercurrent of resentment from a few who saw my family situation as receiving special treatment. The attending who became my unexpected advocate was Dr. Sarah Chen, an oculoplastic surgeon with a teenage son who had cerebral palsy. She pulled me aside after I'd excused myself from a departmental meeting because Emily's home nurse called with concerns, and instead of lecturing me about professionalism, she asked about my daughter's condition. Really asked, with the detailed interest of someone who understood medical complexity from the parent side rather than the physician side. "You can't do this sustainably," she said bluntly. "Not long term. You'll burn out or make a mistake or lose your mind. You need more support, whether that's better home nursing, family help, or finding a partner who can share this load." The partner comment stung because dating was laughable. Who had time? Who had energy? And who would willingly sign up for a relationship where a medically fragile 6-year-old came first, second, and third in priority order? But Dr. Chen was right about needing support. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in caregiver burnout, joined a support group for parents of children with special needs, and reluctantly admitted that I couldn't do everything alone. My parents increased their involvement. My sister started taking Emily 1 weekend a month, and I hired a care coordinator who managed the Byzantine world of insurance approvals and equipment orders. It wasn't enough to make residency easy, but it was enough to make it survivable. Somewhere in the chaos of second-year residency, I started dating again. Nothing serious, just coffee dates with people from apps who mostly ran for the hills when they learned about Emily. Then I met David at a medical conference, a pediatric resident from Cleveland who asked about the photo on my phone's lock screen, and didn't flinch when I explained it was my daughter, and yes, that was a tracheostomy. We dated long distance for 8 months before he admitted he was falling in love with both of us, and I realized I'd found someone who saw Emily as part of the package rather than an obstacle to overcome. The day David met Emily in person, I was terrified she'd reject him or he'd be overwhelmed by the reality of her needs. Instead, I came home from a shift to find them having a dance party in the living room. Emily in her adaptive chair, David spinning her around while music played, both of them laughing. He looked up when I walked in, slightly out of breath, and said, "She likes Bruno Mars. I feel like this is important information I should have known sooner." We got married a year later in my parents' backyard, with Emily as our flower girl. She wore a dress my mother had sewn to accommodate her medical equipment, flowers in her hair, and an expression of pure joy as David and I exchanged vows that included promises about sickness and health that felt more weighted than usual. My sister cried through her maid of honor speech. Dr. Chen came and brought half the ophthalmology department. And Emily, who'd been the reason I'd learned to love before I'd learned to be a doctor, sat in the front row reminding me that the best things in life were never planned. By the time our second daughter was born 3 years later, I'd learned that love didn't follow timelines or logic, And family was something you built from whatever pieces you were given, even if those pieces started in a hospital room with a baby who smiled at strangers. Today, Emily is 13 years old. She still has her tracheostomy, still uses a feeding tube, still requires round-the-clock care that would overwhelm most families. But she hasn't had a major medical crisis in 2 years, a stability we once thought impossible. She lights up when her younger sisters come home from school, communicates through adaptive technology we fought insurance companies to obtain, and has a personality that fills every room she enters. The doctors who said she'd never thrive outside institutional care don't say that anymore. I'm an attending ophthalmologist now, with a practice that accommodates my complicated family life, and a husband who knows Emily's medication schedule as well as I do. My younger daughters, biological children born into a family that already existed, have never known life without their big sister. They defend her fiercely, include her naturally, and are learning empathy and resilience in ways no parenting book could teach. When people ask if I regret the path my life took, derailed from careful plans by one smile in a hospital hallway, I think about breakfast chaos and bedtime routines and the ordinary magic of a family that chose each other. Room 217 is empty now, repurposed for something less heartbreaking. But sometimes I drive past Mercy General and remember the girl who lived there, and the medical student who couldn't walk away, and how love found us both when we needed it most.